Hello, excuse me. Hello, everyone. My name is Nick Malashev. I head up the work at the OECD on better regulation, and it's my real pleasure to be moderating this panel today, where we're going to be exploring the topic of what the crisis has shown us about international collaboration. I'm going to jump straight in to do a polling of you, and but I think the question that we want to ask is, that the crisis has drawn a lot of attention to national responses, but has the crisis made it more or less important for national governments to work together? Now, this isn't a trick question, and we really want your answers to this, just to reflect on how we need to basically change how we work together moving forward. During the session, I want to encourage everyone to get involved in the chat or ask questions and upvote. Upload them to the column in your app. And also, if you're tweeting, please use the hashtag #GovAftershock, all one word, with a cap G, A, and S. I think it's safe to say that government aftershock is a real experiment that the OECD is conducting in terms of trying to improve our collective learning and sense-making of the crisis, and to really look and try to understand what are the implications for governments as an institution. There were over 60 events associated with GovAftershock that were held yesterday in a run-up to today's events. And they were all united by the questions of what governments need to leave behind, what they need to keep, and what they need to do differently. So today we're really exploring this issue about how governments, individuals, societies, communities need to work together collectively to solve the really profound economic and societal problems at hand. I think it's safe to say that the COVID pandemic has had a profound impact on international cooperation. This is truly a global crisis, and one that can only be effectively managed through global cooperation. Yet the trends in the direction of unilateralism, and in some cases outright conflict between nations, have really been reinforced by the pandemic. At one level, I think it's really heartening to see that the international scientific community has come together in really unique ways by sharing the DNA sequence of the virus and sharing research that has led to the rapid development of the vaccine, which is really a miracle. But in terms of how quickly it's been developed. But at the same time, cooperation between governments has been far more haphazard, and I think we're going to delve directly into this in the panel. I think we also need to reflect on the future of globalization. The globalization of goods has already been severely affected and slowed after the 2008 crisis. And I wonder whether there's going to be further erosion post-COVID of the multilateral system, which obviously is a concern for someone who works within that system and is actively trying to promote it. But at the same time, I think it's fairly safe to say that we've seen kind of this virtual globalization from the crisis. I mean, this conference is an excellent example of that. So we also need to reflect on how globalization has and is changing, and how we might need to manage that going forward. And then finally, I think it's worth kind of sort of reflecting on how the COVID pandemic is shedding light on our management of the global commons. There are so many global challenges that we face, from climate change to inequalities from globalization to aging populations. And I think our response to the COVID crisis is a bit of a litmus test in terms of how we deal with these other profound social challenges. So, I think it's fairly clear to say that all of those challenges are transboundary in nature, and we need to work together and have international regulatory cooperation is one of the solutions to overcoming these challenges. And also, I think we really need to reflect on how we strengthen the multilateral system to help nation states address all of this as well. So without further ado, I'm really delighted to introduce our esteemed panelists. We have four of them. Ayelet Bergman is a senior research fellow at the Center for International Law at the National University of Singapore. We have my old friend Jens Heldenstrom, who's the chair of the Business and Industry Advisory Committee, BIAC, to the OECD, and Jens has been BIAC's representative to the Regulatory Policy Committee, which is something that I manage. And in his day job, he's the Director of Markets and Regions for the Confederation of Swedish Industry. I'd also like to welcome Michael Schwager, who's the Director General of IP in Australia, and that's the government agency that handles all of the intellectual property rights issues for the Australian government. And finally, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Mariana Kartunen, who leads our work on international regulatory cooperation in the Regulatory Policy Division at the OECD. So perhaps I'll turn to each of you to introduce yourselves. I'm still looking for the answers to the polling question. Have they not come up yet? Or maybe I'm looking in the wrong place. Am I on mute? No. So maybe we'll reflect on the polling questions maybe in a second, but maybe first over to you, Ayelet, maybe you could just kind of introduce yourselves and just give us a kind of your thinking about this whole issue and the government aftershock briefly. You're muted.
Okay, hi Nick, hi everyone. Thank you very much for having me on this panel. As you've mentioned, I'm a senior research fellow at the Center for International Law at the National University of Singapore. And a lot of my work focuses on global governance and global regulation. So, you know, you'd like me to address the polling question, right? Like, you know, that kind of has the crisis made it more or less important for governments to cooperate? So I think it's quite clear that it's made it more necessary for governments to cooperate. And I also think that we do see, despite all the criticism and the problems that we've witnessed, we do see kind of a mushrooming in cooperation. So we do see a lot of cooperation coming out from international organizations, be it in technical guidance or data collaborations, and we see the rise of different multi-stakeholder partnerships and so forth. Maybe things that we can speak about later. But I think what has really also come out is yes, that we need more cooperation. But that actually many of the problems that existed before COVID-19 and really don't have much to do with COVID-19, but are kind of structural in global governance, are really preventing from reaching an optimal level of cooperation. And perhaps we can speak about those 3 to 4 factors, which I think are kind of preventing us reaching an optimal level of cooperation.
Thanks. Jens, maybe I can turn it over to you if you could introduce yourself and reflect on the polling question.
Yes, thank you very much, Nick. And my first thing is that I'm working for business in Sweden, but also in Europe and the global business BIAC. And when we have discussed this shock of this pandemic, we can talk about major impacts on business, lost companies and lost jobs. But I also have some good stories about international cooperation, and I would like to explore that a little bit. And due to this poll question, I would say we need more international cooperation, we need more trade and globalization, and I will also add things on that. But may I say just a few words about some good things is that businesses have actually changed the production. One well-known Swedish company producing vodka, well known for that, they actually changed to disinfection of alcohol used for everywhere in the pandemic. So companies, small and big, are changing, and they're doing this together with the government, municipalities all over the world. And there were quick actions done by the different governments together with the stakeholders to actually help business and people in need. And then another thing on international regulatory cooperation, I don't know if we go into that right now, but we saw export bans in the beginning of this pandemic. Export bans also on the important things like medical equipment. And one big Swedish company, Mölnlycke, they're actually producing 20% of all these gloves and masks that you are using in surgery in Europe. But the production is all over the world. 90% is coming from different parts of the world to Europe. And there are 4 plants in Europe, in France, Sweden, Poland, and Belgium. And what we can see is actually the 3rd of March, countries in Europe and in other parts of the world actually put bans on medical equipment. But parts are taken together and then are used by all of us. So it took some action in international regulatory cooperation between member states of Europe and other countries. It was businesses were acting and showing this global value change of supply chains, and also that the European Commission were active. And after this, we could see in the 15th of March, which means close to 2 weeks, it was a ban and stopping the free movement of goods, people, and things like that in medical equipment that we all need for the surgeries. So I have examples like this, and the short one is more international cooperation.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. Michael, maybe over to you for some introductory remarks from Australia. And thank you for staying up so late to be with us.
Thanks, Nick. It's a pleasure. I am here in my home office, and I'm slightly paranoid that my dog, who has faithfully followed me into my home office, is about to start barking. So please forgive me if that happens. Can I just respond to the poll question? Yes, I think it's made it quite clear, as the other panelists have already commented, that national governments do need to work with each other. But I also agree with Jens that cooperation has been happening. And it's been happening in a slightly different way than what we have been used to, because we've had to adjust, just like businesses had to adjust. Governments who are working in an internationalized system have also needed to adjust. And I think, certainly from IP Australia's perspective, that has happened, and that has happened rapidly and successfully. We work, obviously, the IP system is an internationalized system. We work very carefully through WIPO. WIPO is one of the more successful technical institutes of the United Nations, and that system has continued to work very well during COVID, despite the fact that in each national jurisdiction and in Geneva, there's been rapid change. I think it's clearly our experience has been that there has been lots of informal discussion and information sharing that has been called and chaired quite successfully and quite nimbly by WIPO in various forms. And they've also been quite successful in working on what we've been calling the sort of hybrid discussions, because not everyone can get to Geneva. And in fact, there's been a good amount of experimentation in how do you maintain the agenda in multilateral fora when many delegates can't get there. And of course, there is consideration of the fact that many delegates can't get there, and that does limit the discussions, and we're still grappling with that. We're still grappling because, as you know, in the multilateral arrangement, so much is done in the margins, and so much is done through that personal contact and that face-to-face and that serendipitous meeting. And it's almost like a pressure cooker environment in some respects to actually get stuff agreed. So that we are still struggling with how to maintain the normative agenda in those forums. but there is a lot of willingness to look at the hybrid mix and accommodate places in my time zone, for example, so that meetings don't necessarily run to 2 a.m. And so there is a lot of flexibility going on. At the same time, there's lots of informal. So the multilateral system is doing its best to cope with this adjustment, but there are informal collaborations, and certainly from IP Australia's perspective, we have many examples of those where national governments are working to achieve international outcomes and to share information and to collaborate. And we have several examples of that in our IP world.
Thanks, Michael. I certainly agree with the limitations of kind of running multilateral business on Zoom. We're having our regulatory policy committee both today through Friday, and we have a couple of really important normative documents in front of us, and that interaction that you just can't quite, get the body language and get the sense of the room when you're doing this online. So I think that is a unique challenge. So Mariana, let me turn it over to you. The polling results are in, and so 71% felt that there was more need for nations to work together, but 7% thought less and 21% about the same. So Mariana, how would you convince those 28% about the need for more international regulatory cooperation, which I'm very pleased with the work that you lead with for the OECD?
Thanks a lot, Nick. And happy to see the polling results came in right now. So just as Nick said, I work at the OECD Regulatory Policy Division, focusing on international regulatory cooperation. And as part of this role, I've been following closely what governments, how they've been responding to the crisis, and in particular, how they've been cooperating with each other or not in this context. So this poll question is very close to home, and indeed, I'll try to answer it myself. And spoiler alert, I think I may be on the side of the 71. So what has the crisis really shown to me so far is that, first of all, as several of you noted, it highlighted that the first reflex of countries, and especially the most powerful and developed countries, just as much as those that are still developing, was to turn national. And with the export bans that Jens mentioned, and the number of simply individual measures that were taken without necessarily learning from others, without necessarily coordinating and really going their own way. And yet, given its global reach, the COVID crisis at the same time brought really to light the inefficiencies of purely national responses to address such an intrinsically global issue. The global health system is really just only as effective as its weakest link, right? So domestic action to eradicate a virus can't in any way work if other countries haven't eradicated, because in virtue of the traveling that happens every day, constantly, and in real time, the virus just continues spreading. So as a lawyer working on regulatory policy and government processes and rulemaking, I note that the crisis has really highlighted a clear mismatch between the global realities of today, calling for cooperation, and the legal and regulatory processes of yesterday, so to speak. And this mismatch was especially apparent during the crisis, but it existed before, and it's an inherent characteristic of our legal and regulatory systems today. So people, companies, goods and services, and now we know diseases as well, cross borders almost in real time constantly, and the planet we live in, like Nick was saying, I mean, with climate change and the loss of biodiversity alone, is facing massive threats that require policy action that just simply cannot be addressed by one country or nation alone. So the good news in a way is that to overcome their initial reflex of national approaches, we quickly saw emerging high-level calls in favor of collaboration, which then resulted progressively in actual collective action. And the other panelists have mentioned some of these. And the good news also here is that governments aren't starting from scratch to collaborate. They have, for example, in particular, international organizations that provide institutional framework and expertise to foster collaboration, to allow for exchanges of experience, of scientific knowledge, and to allow really to develop common action. I'm sure we'll learn today about other forms of collaboration that can complement these traditional actors, and I look forward to hearing from them. But so just to finish up, for me, the most important lesson to be learned from the crisis for governments is for them to learn to cooperate effectively and every day, not just in the crisis, not just because there's momentum to do so. And only by making such cooperation really systematic will they be strong enough to face the next global crisis, because it's coming our way. And so I look forward to the panel discussions, to hearing about how this collaboration can take place.
Thanks, Mariana. It's reassuring to know that our thinking is so like-minded, seeing as you work right across the hallway from me. But I can't agree with the point that you made about the fact that as we move beyond the crisis and rebuild, economies and societies afresh, the innovations moving forward can't be held back by laws and regulations that were designed for the past. I mean, I think it's really critical that we do not go back to the pre-COVID status quo from a regulatory perspective. I think that was one of the key problems with the financial crisis in 2008-9. That there was sort of this idea about we want to go back to normal, whereas in this case we really cannot. So let's delve into some of these questions a little bit more deeply. So Layette, for you, I mean, I think, as you and all of the other panelists did state that kind of the initial reactions to the crisis were highly unilateral in nature. But from your perspective, what has the crisis revealed about the ability and the need for governments to collaborate both with each other and also with other parts of society, particularly in the areas of health and trade, which I think were highly unilateral in nature. And I'm just wondering whether you could comment on which actors have emerged as being the most active in providing international solutions.
Sure, thank you. So, I mean, I think as everyone has already mentioned here, I think there's no question that, there has been a need for collaboration. But what really has come out, again, as I've mentioned before, is that there's a need and there has been international cooperation, but we still have this gap between the need and the ability, and kind of we're not yet at a level we have an optimal level of cooperation. I think that, as I mentioned before, many of the reasons for this don't really have to do anything with COVID-19. They just have been revealed to the general public because of COVID-19. But I think people in the field have known about these issues for a while. And, I think we can talk about four main kind of issues which kind of prevent this optimal cooperation: politics, financing, and capacity, which are in a way traditional problems, which we've always had. And I think the fourth one, which really has come out, is the digital divide. And I'd like to give you a couple of examples from health and trade and kind of show you how that has come about. So if we look, for instance, at the WHO, I think it's an organization from which everyone had very high expectations. But again, it's actually an organization that has quite limited powers, and most of its powers are kind of on technical guidance, provision of data, coordinating different initiatives and partnerships, and it doesn't really have any power to enforce cooperation. And here again, there was a lot of expectations and kind of unhappiness around that. But if you look at the WHO, I mean, the reasons, of course, are politics, which we all know. So I don't think I need to elaborate on that. But even beyond, the geopolitical politics, states don't really want to give an international organization enforcement power, inspection powers. So these are problems that have existed much before COVID. Then we have problems of chronic underfunding. So governments are really not giving enough money for an organization like the WHO. And we also have problems with capacity. So many developing countries really don't have the resources and capacity to implement their obligations. So we now, after the crisis, that has triggered is that we do see some countries coming like from the EU, Germany are pushing for reform of the WHO. So that might kind of, given the crisis, these issues might, who knows, be addressed. Again, we have political issues which might prevent that from happening. Another area which we've seen is informal cooperation, which is COVAX, which is kind of an exciting development in health because it's a multilateral initiative which brings together, as of now, I think about 160 states, if not more, developed and developing countries. And the goal is, and along with other non-state actors, so with the private sector, philanthropic foundations, and so forth. And the goal is to allow for universal access for a vaccine. So that's an interesting and good development. But again, will this be effective? The jury is still out because there's not enough funding. And again, some countries like the United States have decided not to participate. So these are kind of, we see cooperation, but they're limited. And another point I think that we see, we've all spoken about, more regulatory cooperation. But when you listen to, regulators talking together, and yes, they say they are cooperating more and also more broadly, so with more countries. I know, I'm based in Singapore. I know a lot of regulators have been interested in, with how regulators in Singapore and Korea have been handling the crisis. But there as well, what you find is that one of the big problems is the digital divide, so that, different countries are gathering data in different ways. And one of the main challenges is really how do we create interoperability between the data, between the digital technology that we use, so we can actually all rely on one kind of set of data. So I think that's going to be a challenge which could be addressed, but in terms of international cooperation in the health area, but certainly also beyond. I mean, this digital divide is really something I think which applies to any kind of international cooperation these days, and which should probably be high on the agenda for any governmental cooperation. If we look at trade, WTO, as you've all mentioned, there's been a lot of criticism about the export restrictions, but still, even the WTO has had a role in the pandemic. So, for instance, we have the trade facilitation agreement, which in a way has been like the unsung hero of the pandemic because it has allowed for more, removal of red tape around essential goods. And the WTO also, provides data and so forth. But again, if you look at trade, the problems here are much earlier than the pandemic and have really to do with much more structural problems of having a multilateral setting with, a wide set of diverse interests, and it's very hard to reach any kind of agreement. And negotiations have been deadlocked for quite a while within the WTO. And I think there, we see regional trade agreements like now with RCEP, which has been concluded, but we actually out of this deadlock, I think what we will see, because I hear many more voices, kind of being supportive of having plurilateral agreements, having just agreements of coalitions of the willing. What else? I think another thing coming out in the trade area is, again, what I just mentioned about the digital divide. There's a lot of talk about using blockchain to monitor supply chains. But again, the risk there is if we use different technologies, how will we be able to cooperate? So I guess overall, like I said in the beginning, I think it's quite clear that international cooperation in health and trade is needed and desired, and we do see international cooperation, but it does not reach its optimal level, or the level we'd like to see it to really solve our collective problems for these, I think, three traditional problems, which are politics, lack of sufficient financing and capacity, okay, of course, depending on the organization, and really this kind of new problem, which is, the divide in data and digital technologies. So that would be great if we'd see more cooperation around that. And in terms of which actors have emerged as most active, I actually think governments, they've really shown to us that, the rumors of the death of governments is not true. Governments have been very, very active. And, of course, the industry, the private sector, I think has been obviously scientific, and the scientific community have really come out. Philanthropic organizations as well, like the Gates Foundation, which have been putting a lot of money into these things. So it's definitely been, I think, we do see, again, I think the point to make here is it's not new. These are things, these are trends. I mean, as Mariana mentioned before, these are trends that have existed much before COVID-19, that we see a diverse set of actors. In that sense, it's not new. We just see in a very short time frame a lot of activity, kind of mushrooming, but in a way, in the very, along the same kind of architecture which has existed before. So that's it for me at this point.
Thanks for all of those comments. I can certainly speak to the relevance of politics and finance in the OECD. Those are two things that sometimes come in short supply. So I'd certainly agree with all those points that you made. Jens, maybe over to you. I mean, you already mentioned a number of instances in terms of how businesses, both globally and in Sweden, were impacted by these unilateral trends. I'm wondering if you could just delve a little bit more deeply into what you think are the major drawbacks that are faced by business. And could you give us a couple of examples of international collaboration that provided to be most useful in terms of addressing those disruptions?
Yes, thank you, Nick. I would say the drawbacks was, of course, the bans and the stop of trade and so on. So that were major impacts on the supply chains. The consumption went down, traveling, and of course, movement of people. And in a globalized world, this is a major drawback for us all. And if I turn that a little bit, the lockdowns and things like that we all had suffered from, we realized that a total lockdown, that's not possible for a society. Even if we want to stop something, a virus, we need to keep on with the hospitals and other important things in the society. And what we also learned was that trade between countries, which are built on international regulatory cooperation, were actually very helpful. So the first few weeks were really hard, and people went back to the national, like many have already said. But from business side, that was really, really hard. And they were, of course, raising their hands to get some help from the society, help back, because they have paid the taxes. So they wanted some support in these hard times. But I would like to turn a little bit, because we came back quite quickly on track again. And I would say that was due to these trade deals that we already have, and due to the international cooperation. And that is very, very important to say. And perhaps is also after 10 years of negotiations between the countries, the Asian countries, the 15 countries that actually found a deal just a few days ago, showing that this stop that we had because of the pandemic is not useful. Everybody realized, I believe, and especially these countries, this is really good example, that they need to take away unnecessary burdens and to trade and have trade deals with each other, because we are living in the globalized world. And I was thinking we have actually seen the trends of global and European trends to impose trade restrictions. We have seen trends of restriction of movement of people. But I'm happy to say that the trade deal with 1/3 of the population on this planet was actually finding a deal during this crisis that we are in. And I would say something that we should talk more about, the valuable supply chain, because everything that are produced have parts from all over the world. And I think people in the polls that were sent out in many member states of the OECD, showing that the importance of businesses and other people that were active during these hard times, they got support, and you could see their role in the society. So what I'm saying is, with the globalized world, is that we shouldn't talk about made in Sweden or made in China. I would say we should talk about made in the global world, because the parts are coming from everywhere, and we need each other. So we need to restore the trust in global supply chains, I would say, because that's how everything is working. And like it was said, a very good thing that have come out with this tragedy is digital transformation and international cooperation on research as well. Both governmental and private sector have worked together and actually done something that we have never seen before. I'll stop there. Major impacts, and we need to have open societies. If not, it will be major drawbacks again.
Thank you for all of those very relevant points, Jens. It's interesting how you mentioned the fact that, you know, these existing or the negotiated trade deals were really one of the paths forward. I guess maybe this would be a question for the future. You know, I sometimes it's a concern that these regional trade deals might lock in, you know, kind of an Asia economy, and a European economy, and a North American economy, and you know, there's that doesn't support true multilateralism. But the other point you mentioned about these global goods, certainly the research that the OECD has done on trade and value added, it very much shows that point, that it's really, you know, having an open economy and being able to provide value added within these global supply chains is really key. Now over to you, Michael. You know, I think it's obvious that rules are the basis really of the international order, but I think the crisis has shown that there have also been much kind of less formal collaboration that can occur when given the chance. So I'm wondering if you could maybe reflect on how sort of the more codified and structural formal collaboration can also provide space for these new and emerging mechanisms that sort of involve much softer forms of collaboration.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I think we do have an example that I think might provide a bit of a case study, or at least some hope for the sorts of experimentation or new ways of doing things that I've mentioned before. And I'll give the example of what we call IP GAIN, or what we call the IP Global AI Network. It's a little bit of a proof of concept or beta product that we've been developing, and particularly working with the UK and having a bit of support from the Europeans and the Americans on. And just to set the scene a bit, as you can imagine, national IP offices have vast data sets and limited collaboration across national boundaries in extracting the value from those data sets. Obviously, WIPO has a lot of data, and the interesting thing is we are all developing separately similar solutions for artificial intelligence or machine learning, and looking at how we integrate that in our own national offices. Less well-resourced offices, and this goes to the digital divide, of course, less well-resourced offices might have limited or no access to data scientists. They might not have experts on machine learning or AI tools to develop the different solutions. So what we were looking at is the opportunity to build a platform to foster international collaboration and co-development of practices and technology around machine learning in the context of patent offices and how they work, because in an internationalized system, there is a lot of similarity in what each of those national offices have to do. So we launched the proof of concept in September last year. We're expecting a beta version of it to be developed probably by mid next year, the September quarter of next year, perhaps. And the idea is to bring IP offices together to develop novel approaches to that technology, reduce duplication, and create a simple and secure way to share openly the development of artificial intelligence tools. Certainly from IP Australia's perspective, we're happy to share our experimentation on this, and hopefully other national offices and third parties for that matter. And that really, we hope, will overcome some of the digital divide issues that I mentioned before, where some offices just don't have the capacity. So the idea is it functions a bit like an app store or a marketplace. 3 core elements to it: a platform or store, the tool access to the AI tools via a browser, and also APIs and tool source code repository for sharing, licensing, and co-development. And it allows users of the space to come in and check the offerings, such as an AI system for the patent classification process that might come through the international system. And it allows people to collaborate through a browser or through an API function for various queries. And hopefully we'll add more to that over time. I've mentioned we've actively been collaborating with the UK office. We've had interest from the European and United States offices. And we've been presenting at various WIPO committees to try to get interest on that. We've had positive feedback on both the user experience and the platform design. Obviously, its viability will depend on uptake and overcoming national differences on things like security standards could be an issue. But we think it has a lot of potential because it's not just a blog, or it's not just a shared space. It actually has more structure than that because of the code repository, the platform, the ability to look around. So it's a bit more of a curated shared space. But it's an interesting experiment, and we're hoping that will be at least a possible model for how you overcome some of the issues that we're currently facing, where you can't all sit in a room and work in a multilateral committee room of WIPO, but still overcome some of the digital divide issues because of the ease of technology and the ability to particularly share expertise from one area to another, where there's no particular interest in holding it back. It's in fact better for all of us if we can speed up the processes across the international IP system by sharing some of these tools. So I just wanted to touch on that as maybe a case study to give us a bit of hope that the adversity created at the moment will in fact lead to the sorts of innovations that traditionally it usually does.
Thank you, Michael. That sounds like a terrific initiative, and I wish you much success in terms of bringing it forward. I mean, clearly, I think the whole digital ecosystem has really put intellectual property into at risk. So I think it's a great initiative. Mariana, maybe if I could turn to you. I mean, obviously, I think the crisis, both predating COVID, but certainly exacerbated by COVID, has shown the multilateral system in not such a good light. I'm just wondering what lessons has the crisis brought to traditional multilateral actors, and what do we need to do for multilateralism to be better prepared for the future shocks? How do we address those issues that Alayet mentioned in terms of politics, financing, and capacity.
Thanks a lot, Nick. And thanks to all the panelists for their very insightful views and experience on different forms of international cooperation. To answer your question, Nick, I'm going to focus on the more traditional actors of the multilateral system. So basically international organizations, which are particularly under the limelight and under the criticisms that have been taking place against the multilateral system. And just to begin, before whatever the criticisms may be and however founded they are, let me just start by recalling that the very raison d'être, or the reason for which international organizations were created, regardless of their mandate, whichever the sector in which they intervene, is to support their members, most commonly governments, in developing the right policies for their population's well-being. And so really to help governments regulate on an international level. And they do this by offering governments a space to exchange, to learn from each other, and to agree on common approaches through the development of international rules and standards that are then adopted at the national level. And the institutional setting and expert-driven decision-making processes that international organizations have offer valuable guarantees to deliver on these objectives. Still, as you were saying, Nick, international organizations face a number of criticisms. They are viewed as distant bureaucracies, sometimes slow political machinery, and these criticisms were exacerbated in the COVID context, which put major pressure on these IOs to deliver rapid solutions to urgent health, economic, and social needs, but also asking organizations to meet and to react when the very organization of international meetings and therefore the actual rulemaking itself was made very difficult by the fact that by the lockdown measures and travel restrictions which prevented these from happening. The criticisms that IOs face are not new. We conducted a survey in 2016 to find out what the major challenges were that IOs were facing to make their actions and rules effective. And what we found is that most IOs were struggling to remain inclusive, to consult efficiently with stakeholders, that they often lacked the mandate and methodologies to truly calculate their impact, and that many IOs struggled to coordinate with other bodies who have parallel mandates and to ensure coherence in their action. Now, because these challenges are not new, there have already been active efforts to overcome them. And whatever the solutions that I'll try to raise a bit to rethink multilateralism going forward should build already on these past and ongoing efforts. So first of all, organizations, there's a kind of active change that started at a broad systemic level with the IO landscape becoming more and more diverse to respond better to the global needs. So we heard from other actors that there are different types of collaboration forums and of international actors that are emerging, but just focusing on what can be called international organizations per se, that have a secretariat, that have representatives from several countries, and that develop international rules and standards. It's important to note that international organizations go well beyond traditional intergovernmental organizations that are most famous to the layperson. For example, an increasing range of private standard setting bodies develop market-driven standards, serving as a reference, particularly for industry, typically, for example, to guarantee product safety while enabling fluid international trade. And in more recent years, transgovernmental networks of regulators are a form of organizations that have emerged in specific sectors. Now, perhaps a bit similar to what Michael was describing a little bit, but typically these are bodies that bring together specialized units of national governments, such as regulatory agencies, together with non-governmental actors from the private sector or technical experts, and develop specialized instruments for their sector. Now, to make the best of the multilateral system today, it's important to see all of its actors as part of a common rule-based system. And looking at this system as a whole, governments already have a plethora of solutions that exist to address their challenges. Secondly, IOs individually, regardless of their status or legal nature, are already striving for relevance and working to adapt to their new realities. Many IOs are undergoing ambitious reforms to better consult with stakeholders, to assess implementation of their instruments, to coordinate among each other. And in the context of COVID in particular, many adapted their working methods to ensure that decisions and rules could be adopted virtually under short time pressures. With this adapted working methods, IOs have been offering targeted responses to COVID-19. For example, with policy advice, targeted policy advice, the OECD alone, just to make some corporate publicity, has 158 policy briefs in virtually all areas of our policy work to help governments design policies, but also other organizations have actually been adapting or delivering dedicated instruments. For example, the International Civil Aviation Organization developed a number of quick reference guides to ensure the continuity of aviation business and operations while protecting passengers against health threats. Or Interpol developed guidelines on how to protect law enforcement and first responders in the context of COVID-19. So there are countless examples of how IO action in the current crisis can help governments and cooperate, and individual efforts by IOs are still essential to continue remaining relevant. And finally, the third and I would not say certainly least efforts to overcome the crisis and prepare resilience for future ones is for international organizations to be more exemplary and effective as a whole. And for this purpose, I want to highlight the importance of a collective undertaking of 50 IO partners that are jointly committed to improving the quality of their rulemaking via the IO Partnership for Effective International Rulemaking, which we act as a secretariat for at the OECD, and which is currently finalizing a compendium of IO practices that sets key principles for organizations to follow to make their rules, to make international rules as a whole more inclusive with better stakeholder engagement, more effective with better evaluation of international rules and of their impact, more systematically implemented with better support to implementation from secretariats, and more coherent with stronger and more systematic coordination among international organizations. These focus areas are not by chance. The IO partnership took as a starting point the major weaknesses of international rulemaking, identified via the survey that I mentioned before, and chose to address them one by one. So we look forward to presenting this to you. And to summarize, I think that the multilateral system to deliver best for citizens worldwide can really benefit from these three complementary solutions: leveraging multilateral bodies as a whole and as complementary actors by targeting individual reforms in individual IOs, and with collective work from IOs to improve international rulemaking as a whole. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you, Mariana. It's interesting. We just got a question. How can or should this unprecedented crisis lead to a revitalization and rethinking of multilateralism? I think you definitely addressed some of those issues in your presentation. And for whoever posed that question, stay tuned to the OECD. We're developing, Mariana is developing some it's called a compendium of good practice of international rulemaking, which we'll probably be releasing. We're discussing it tomorrow, and we'll hopefully be releasing it sometime in early 2021, which really does try to get to that idea in terms of how can practices of multilateral practices of international organizations be improved. We're running a bit short of time, but I thought there was a really interesting question that was kind of sort of challenging the traditional notions of jurisdictions. And is the nation state still relevant for addressing some of these truly global challenges? And I kind of, I forwarded it to Alayat. So maybe over to you, and what are your reflections on that? I thought that was really kind of a pretty existential question, if you will. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Yes, you know what? I think if should I read out the question so everyone knows exactly what the question is? So can we imagine new territorial models based on the global nature of challenges such as in environment, refugees, COVID, financial, and so forth? Is the notion of country or territory outdated? And could we have new structures based on other criteria than territory? Actually, I think if there's anything that we've seen in the past 4 years, is that the notion of country is not outdated. I mean, it appears that, with the rise of populism and nationalism, it seems that, most people still are very much attached to their country. And there doesn't seem to have been a different kind of organizing model which replaces the state. So that's thing. So I don't think the state is going anywhere anytime soon. At the same time, I mean, it is important to point out that we do have already now, we have other organizing models which go beyond territories and which are based on interests. So if you look at multinational companies, if we look at, international NGOs, think of Oxfam. And I think also, increasingly we have virtual groups, right, based on interests on whatever topic, right? You can connect with people that are like you in different countries. So I do think we have that. The question is, will they be making the decisions? And I think that's, what we've kind of also talked about now, is that increasingly these groups are actually working a lot alongside governments. So yes, I think governments are here to stay, but it's quite clear that we see a rise in multi-stakeholder partnerships. And actually just purely governmental cooperation is somewhat outdated. We still have areas where it's pretty much just governments, perhaps security or finance. But if we look at all these public issues like environment or health, I think what's really become clear also now with COVID is that there is a lot of cooperation between this traditional model of the state and all these other organizing models. And I think we'll see more of that. I mean, obviously the Sustainable Development Goals, they really push governments to go in that direction. And also linking to the issue of data, I think we're just going to see, governments are so dependent on non-state actors for data and knowledge. And obviously this is the age of data. So we're going to see even more dependency and more cooperation with these other actors alongside governments. So.
Thanks, that's very provocative. Maybe we just have a couple of minutes left. Maybe over to you, Jens. Just one final question. Personally, what are you committed to doing in the wake of the crisis?
What we are doing.
What you are doing.
Yeah, we have the pandemic right now. Yesterday we had the fires in the world. We had tsunamis. We have crisis after crisis. So we need to prepare for the crisis. And the best solution is open societies, international regulatory cooperation, and trade. That's my short answer. And we need to look at the experience that we have seen, for example, with the export ban on medical equipment during a pandemic. What we need to learn from that. And just one word on multilateral organizations. We are supportive to them, but everybody had to reform a little bit, and especially the ones that were stressed stakeholder involvement. Business is one of the stakeholders. So made in the global world, I would say, we need to think the globalization is a good answer of many issues. Cooperation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jens. Michael, maybe your final thoughts. What are you personally committed to doing differently in terms of not so much maybe IP Australia, but just kind of looking forward, what's most fundamentally changed in your professional outlook?
So I think it's looking for those. As Isla was saying, it's not the traditional government to government. It's about looking at how NGOs, business, civil society, various sectors come together to look at collaboration. And I think that's something that we're able to do with particularly the application of technology. And that's where we'll be pursuing our collaboration across borders for the future.
Thanks, Michael. Mariana, I'm going to exercise my managerial prerogative and not give you a final word because we have to jump off and go to our Regulatory Policy Committee meeting, which is starting at 12. But please let me, I mean, I wish we could give a big round of applause to all the panelists. I'll do it myself. It was a great panel. Thanks for your insights. Thanks for joining us, and looking forward to continuing this conversation going forward. All the best to everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.